For me, the hardest moment was December 2016, before President Obama departed the White House. He pushed, together with Secretary Kerry, a resolution condemning Israel, calling our presence in the old city of Jerusalem a flagrant violation of international law. But at that moment, I was by myself in the lion's den because I was fighting the US.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, jns.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. For decades, supporters of Israel have debated what to do about the United Nations. Should they ignore it as a talking shop that makes a lot of noise but can't impact events on the ground in the Middle East? Or should they treat its growing efforts to smear Israel as an apartheid state as a genuine threat to the Jewish state? Many Israelis, including many in the government, have trouble taking the UN seriously. Israel's first prime minister and founding father, David Ben-Gurion, famously dismissed the concerns of Moshe Sharett, who served as his foreign minister and initial successor, about the importance of the world body. Using the Hebrew acronym for the UN, Ben-Gurion disputed the idea that without UN backing in the 1947 partition resolution, the Jewish state wouldn't have been founded. Not at all, Ben-Gurion responded. Only the daring of the Jews founded this country, and not some shmum resolution. That sentiment expressed Ben-Gurion's admirable philosophy that the actions of the Jews were far more important than the opinions of the non-Jewish world. Several decades later, it still accurately sums up the way many Israelis feel about the UN, which is even more hostile to their nation than it was in Ben-Gurion's time. The world body's bias against the Jewish state is baked into the cake due to the dominance of Islamist, Marxist, and Third World nations that buy into the lie that Zionism is racism. That bias has been expressed in many ways over the years, from the General Assembly's passage in 1975 of the infamous Zionism is racism resolution, to its role in convening the 2001 Durban Conference on Racism, which became an anti-Semitic hate fest. The UN and its various agencies are a steady source of reports, programs, as well as resolutions aimed at undermining the Jewish state's security and bolstering the Palestinian century-old war on Zionism. The UN Relief Works Agency, UNRWA, is solely focused on ensuring that the descendants of the Palestinian Arabs who fled the country during Israel's 1948 War of Independence remain stateless refugees to be used as propaganda to delegitimize the existence of a Jewish state. Still, it is the Human Rights Council, a body whose membership is composed of some of the worst human rights offenders on the planet, that has become the principal source of anti-Israel invective via biased reports that distort the truth about the conflict and the reality of a democratic country which has been forced to defend itself against terrorism and military and even nuclear threats every day of its existence. It is particularly important now since the UN General Assembly voted to fund a commission of inquiry run by the UNHRC about human rights in Israel and the administered territories. Much like the biased and anti-Zionist attacks on the Jewish state from international leftist groups that masquerade as advocates for human rights, such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, the Commission of Inquiry is set up to deliver a verdict about Israel's conduct. It's one that has little to do with a theoretical peace agreement in which the Palestinians have no interest, but rather is aimed at demonizing the very idea of a Jewish state and to delegitimize its right to self-defense. Given an open-ended mandate that allowed Israel's enemies to go back in time to indict it for supposed crimes dating back to the period before there was even a Jewish state, the commission invited submissions from the Palestinians and others to prove their case. Aptly characterized as a kangaroo court, it is set up to deliver a report later this year that will bolster the apartheid state lie. This presents both Israel and groups that monitor the UN and the fraudulent human rights community with a difficult choice. The government of Israel chose not to engage with the commission. It thought that doing so would legitimize a process that is utterly lacking in objectivity, since everything the UNHRC and the Commission have done has been aimed at building a case that treats the Jewish state's existence as a crime against humanity. The staff of the UNHRC's headquarters in Geneva don't care what the Israelis might have to say about the war on their country. But many organizations that deal with this issue were determined that this bogus process would not go unanswered. The result was an unprecedented effort to remind the world body that their tunnel vision ignored the suffering of Jews and Israelis during the course of the Arab and Muslim war on Zionism. If the UN and the human rights community wanted to count victims, they can start by contemplating the millions of Jews who were victimized by anti-Zionist policies and actions. That includes the Jews who died in the Holocaust as a result of efforts to prevent their escape to Palestine, or as the result of anti-Zionist rhetoric, or the subsequent wars and terrorism attacks launched against Israel by its enemies. The total of those whose plight deserves attention also includes the approximately 800,000 Jews who were forced to flee their homes in the Arab and Muslim world due to the anti-Semitic hate, discrimination, and violence directed against them by anti-Israel Arab governments and movements. Gathering these names was a Herculean task that required a great deal of difficult research and work. Led by Professor Ann Bayevsky of Human Rights Voices and the Touro Institute on Human Rights in the Holocaust, groups like Palestine Media Watch, the Meir Amit Intelligence and Terrorist and Information Center, MEMRI, the American Israel Cooperative Enterprise, and the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis, CAMRA, all contributed to the task of compiling names of Jewish victims and refugees. Altogether, they have made submissions of more than 2 million names of Jews who were killed or hurt by anti-Zionist Jew haters. It's true that the Commission is unlikely to pay much attention to the list of Jewish victims, since they have not yet even acknowledged receipt of these submissions. Their only purpose is to discuss the grievances of Palestinians and the alleged injustice that the regaining of sovereignty by Jews over their ancient homeland has done to the world. But it is a vital reminder that the real injustice is the unwillingness of the world to fully acknowledge crimes committed against the Jewish people because of a desire to keep them powerless and homeless. It's also important because as much as the UN lacks legitimacy, it isn't disappearing anytime soon. In a more just world, such a corrupt and anti-Semitic body that serves the interests of tyrants would be abolished. It should be replaced by a world body controlled by democracies and tasked with the defense of human rights rather than undermining them. But we don't live in such a world. The UN is unfortunately here to stay. Though Israel has thrived and grown into an economic dynamo and regional military power, it is not immune to the efforts of the international community to stigmatize it. Even in the United States, where most Americans remain solidly pro-Israel, support for intersectional ideology and critical race theory, which labels Israel as an oppressor, white privileged state, is widespread in the Democratic Party's vocal left wing. And the more that bodies with the immature of international legitimacy embrace lies about Israel and Zionism, the more precarious the position of defenders of Israel will be. The United States ought to withdraw from the UNHRC and defund it. That's something that the Trump administration did, but which was reversed by the Biden administration, whose foreign policy team remains infatuated with multilateralism and diplomacy for its own sake. That's why an shmum attitude is a luxury that Israel and its friends can no longer afford. The response to the Commission of Inquiry was a good start, but it must be followed up by a renewed concern about the threat from the UN. The world body's lies can do real damage to Israel and the Jewish people if they go unanswered. And now to our interview of the week. What should Friends of Israel do about the United Nations? It's a problem that has confounded Israelis and Friends of the Jewish State for decades. On the one hand, Israel has made genuine progress in becoming accepted in the UN bureaucracy and its agencies in recent years. But in spite of this, the automatic anti-Israel majority is a given, and the debates about Israel at the UN are always tilted against the Jewish state and in favor of those who wish for its destruction. How then should Israel approach the world body? Should it just ignore the efforts of the UN Human Rights Commission and the Commission of Inquiry to delegitimize it? Or should it be fully engaged with the world body, either to answer Zionism's foes or to hope to win friends? At a time when the influence of intersectionality and critical race theory is growing in the United States, and especially on the left wing of the Democratic Party, the idea of complacency about efforts to delegitimize Israel would be deeply foolish. But with so many other threats and distractions, it's far from clear that Israel's defenders are fully focused on how the UN and the Commission of Inquiry can advance the apartheid state lie in ways that can't be ignored. To discuss this with us, we're fortunate to have with us someone who has been in the middle of this argument and who has extensive experience representing the State of Israel as well as analyzing its problems. Danny Danon was Israel's 17th ambassador to the UN, serving in that role from 2015 to 2020. Prior to that, he was a member of the Knesset for the Likud Party for 6 years, during which he served in various capacities, including as Deputy Minister of Defense and Minister of Science, Technology, and Space. Born in Ramat Gan, Danon is a veteran of the Israel Defense Forces and served as the Jewish Agency's emissary to the Jewish community of Miami. Currently, the chairman of World Likud, he was the author of a 2012 book, Israel, the Will to Prevail, and the about to be published In the Lion's Den. Danny Danon, welcome to Top Story.
Thank you for having me today, Jonathan.
Well, it's great to have you with us. We're really grateful for you taking the time. I want to start by asking you about the current situation, which sums up so much of the dilemma that Israel faces at the UN. The Commission of Inquiry of the Human Rights Council is set to deliver a report later this year that is certain to be an effort to bolster the apartheid state lie. The Israeli government chose not to engage with this kangaroo court, but a group of organizations that monitor the UN or support Israel have been sort of taking up the invitation from the Commission to the world to make submissions about human rights violations, and they're listing the Jews who were victimized by anti-Zionists, including those killed in the Holocaust, killed by wars and terrorism, or were displaced from their homes in the Arab world. It's not clear that either approach influences the UN, but there are some conclusions to be drawn from this about how to respond to the anti-Semites of the UN agencies. What do you make of this situation?
Well, there is nothing new with that inquiry. It's a one-sided committee. We know the outcome. The Israeli government decided to ignore the committee, and I think that was the right decision. We know that we have a moral military, and we will continue to defend our people while keeping our moral in a very high ground. I'm very proud of the IDF, and that's why I think we should ignore the committee. And with the Human Rights Council, I think that the US should reconsider its position, whether to stay there or not. You know, when I served with Ambassador Nikki Haley, my position and recommendation was that in a place that you have no influence, you should not stay there, and you should not fund such a place when you know it's being used to attack your allies.
Danny, that's an excellent point. I guess one of the things I want to ask about is sort of Israeli attitudes towards the UN, and you as someone who served there can sort of speak to this. The traditional Israeli attitude towards the UN is sort of was summed up, Ben-Gurion famously said, shmum, about, that it was more important what the Jews do than what the non-Jewish world say. And that, is a great truth. But obviously, Israel can't ignore the UN, not entirely. It has to engage to some extent. Do you think Israelis, as in general, understand that the efforts to delegitimize Israel at the UN and in the international community, that actually does present a real threat to Israel in some ways?
Jonathan, I think that most Israelis today agree that we cannot ignore the UN. We have to be there. We have to fight back. Mm-hmm. And, whenever Prime Minister Netanyahu came to the General Assembly and gave a strong speech, many Israelis were very proud. Or when I had a very strong speech at the Security Council, the media in Israel covered it, and I got a lot of feedbacks from many Israelis. So we don't ignore it. But we understand that we have to start to change the narrative, and we are doing it. We are doing it by bringing other issues to the table. So, if you take, for example, the issue of technology or support to developing countries, we have the know-how. We can present solutions to many countries, and that's what we should continue to do. And in my book, In the Lion's Den, I speak about the fact that many of the African ambassadors came to me with requests to find solutions for their problems. And it was about medical issues, agriculture, you name it. I think we should continue with that approach that, maybe we cannot solve the conflict with the Palestinians tomorrow, but we can solve health problems in developing countries tomorrow.
Well, that goes to your specific experience, and I want to just start in discussing your years in, as you say, the lion's den. What was the most gratifying moment there, and what was the most depressing moment for you, in terms of all the various experiences that you had serving in New York?
So it was a roller coaster. 5 years you have up and downs every day. But for me, the hardest moment was December 2016, before President Obama departed the White House. He pushed together with Secretary Kerry a resolution condemning Israel, calling our presence in the old city of Jerusalem a flagrant violation of international law. And for me, it was hard because I was used to fight. I'm a fighter by nature, but I was used to fight the Palestinians, the EU, sometimes other countries. But at that moment, I was by myself in the lion's den because I was fighting the US. The US was pushing the resolution forward, and for me it was difficult. I speak in the book. I write about the moments before the vote. The minutes. I realized that the US will not be with us. I was trying to get an answer for my colleague Ambassador Samantha Powell about what would be the position of the US in the vote, and she told me that she's waiting for instructions from the president. And I told her, okay, so let's make the call. Let's put Prime Minister Netanyahu on the line with the president, and we should get an answer. The vote is tomorrow. And the answer I got was that the president is on a vacation in Hawaii, and they cannot put the call together. On that moment, I realized that I'm by myself. That was the hardest point. I had many achievements, and I will never forget the minute I got the results of the vote when I presented my name to become the chairman of the legal committee. We have 6 committees at the UN, and for the first time we ran for a position, and it was in the General Assembly, secret ballots, and I received the support of 109 member states that supported me, and I became the first Israeli ever to chair a UN committee. So it showed me that we have a support, not public yet, but quiet. And I think the challenge for the future is to close that gap between what the countries really think about Israel to what they actually say it publicly. We have to close that gap.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And yes, that was number one. That was sort of a historic moment for Israel at the UN, that with finally being treated like a legitimate state, like every other state. But it also shows that and you certainly experienced this. You just alluded to it. There are countries that privately think very differently from the way they act and vote in the UN, and that even includes some of the nations that have made peace with Israel, in the Arab and Muslim world, and some who have normalized relations as a result of the Abraham Accords. When they're in New York, they don't sound the same way as they do when they're speaking privately with Israelis or even with Americans about the situation with the Palestinians. How does Israel overcome that dynamic? Because in the international community, when you're in these places, whether it's in New York or in Geneva, the mindset is so set against Israel, that Israel is this violator of human rights. All these lies that they perpetrate, that they spread. How do you get beyond that?
Well, they know better, and it's frustrating that that they know better and they still play the game. And I think the challenge is to push them to publicly acknowledge Israel for what it is. And take, for example, the UAE. I was working and collaborating with the UAE and other countries in the UN years ago. I traveled to the UAE when I was at the UN in 2016. We fought against Iran, against Hezbollah, against radical Muslims in different countries, but they always told me, Danny, we should keep it, very quiet, very discreet. And I told them why. Nothing will happen to you. And I think today, you see after the Abraham Accords, the, the the success stories, the excitement on both sides, and you understand that other countries can do the same, should acknowledge Israel for what it is, it will make them stronger. And that's what I'm telling now my friends in those countries that are not recognizing Israel yet. I tell them, look at the UAE today, 14 flights from Tel Aviv, millions, hundreds of millions of trade deals during the last year. You can be there also. And I think it's a good message for the world.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It's so much to their advantage, and yet, the sort of it's like two sides talking past each other. On the one hand, Israel's relations with the Arab world are so much better. You certainly experienced this at the UN even before the Abraham Accords. And yet, at the same time, within the international community, it seems, certainly in Europe, and even to some extent here in the United States, that the anti Zionist sentiment, which is, I think, rooted in ideas like intersectionalism and critical race theory, seems to be getting stronger. There's more talk, there's more anti Zionist talk, and articles printed in the New York Times today than there ever were 10 or 20 years ago. Again, there's this disconnect here, isn't there?
Yes, and that's unfortunate when you look at the numbers, of anti-Semitism worldwide, BDS. And today, it's not politically correct to be an anti-Semite, so they become anti-Zionist or anti-Israel, and that's what's happening at the UN and in some of the capitals around the world. And it's much easier to spread hate. With social media, you can spread those lies very fast. And in the book, I write about that we need to stand up. When I put together an event at the Queen's Museum to celebrate the historical decision for the establishment of the State of Israel at the UN, I had to fight to actually make it happen because some BDS supporters try to prevent us from holding the event on this historical location. So we always have to fight back, even when you are the UN ambassador or you are a student on campus, a professor. The message is that it's an ongoing. It's not going to end. Even we win some, we lose some, but we have to wake up every morning, understanding that we have to fight back.
Yeah, I think that's very true. One of the sort of perennial debates within the pro-Israel community that's been around as long as we've been around, but me as a journalist, you as someone working for Israel, is what can Israel do to better get across its message to the rest of the world? The question of how does Israel fix its Hasbara problem? I mean, that's been talked about for decades. And at times, various solutions have been tried. At one point, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was trying to rebrand Israel and just try to make people just think about beaches and pretty girls and smart scientists instead of the conflict. Of course, that didn't work because it doesn't matter how nice the beaches are or how pretty the girls are. If you think Israel's an apartheid state, you're still going to hate it. How much progress has Israel made in terms of getting a smart message across to the world, answering the lies about it?
First, I will tell you, Jonathan, something which is not very popular. And I'm saying it as somebody who cares about Hasbara and about our image. And I devoted my life, since the age of 21, I'm dealing with Hasbara as a shaliach, as a member of Knesset, ambassador. But I would tell you something, that you might beg to disagree with me. I prefer to fail in Hasbara, but to win in the battleground. Meaning that I prefer to be in a place where our soldiers are strong and winning, and then we have to deal with the UN or with the CNN or with the liberal media. I prefer to be in the position where we are today, rather the opposite, that we will actually lose and people will look at Ukraine today. They have great PR, great Hasbara for Ukraine, but they're not able to defend their borders. But having said that, I think you have a point. We have to invent ourselves, be smarter, And it's a debate. I always tell my colleagues in the IDF, you have to provide us, with ammunition, with information, and do it fast enough so we can react. But the military, the answer I get is that first we have to deal with the situation on the ground, then we can deal with helping you guys sending the message. I think we have to work on that. That you're gonna have experts on site that will be able to share the information immediately, because sometimes it's too late. Once we get the footage and the facts, nobody listens because the lies are already all out there.
Yeah, actually, I happen to agree with you. I think the moral high ground is fine. The actual high ground is better from Israel's point of view. Its first obligation is to defend its citizens against the people trying to kill them, regardless of how it plays on television in the United States or in Europe. However, that still leaves plenty of room for improvement. And I guess one of the things that I have noticed as a reporter, covering various Israeli diplomats, dating back long before, you were there at the UN, is that within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there is a certain mindset about not antagonizing Israel's enemies, it seems to me. Whereas instead of talking about rights, they talk Jewish rights, they talk about security. They tend to soft pedal the argument rather than taking the enemy head on. That seems to be ingrained. That's part of the diplomatic mindset. But have you noticed that in terms of your own work in Hasbara and in representing Israel as well?
Well, I actually came with a completely different approach, and people told me, Danny, it's not the Knesset. You have to act as a diplomat. And I told him the opposite. You have to be passionate. You have to speak about our tradition, about Judaism, about the rights to the land. And I recall, Jonathan, one of the speeches, I actually put my yarmulke on my head and I read from the Bible. And my colleagues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs told me, Danny, we never use the Bible in the Security Council, because we speak about diplomacy, international law. And I told them that's a mistake because everything starts from the Bible. And Jonathan, I got such a great response from Muslim ambassadors who approached me after the speech and told me, we cannot agree with you because of politics, and we cannot say publicly what we think about your speech. But we really admire the fact that you read from your holy book, because we are religious and we believe in our holy book. So I think once you come with the passion and you respect your tradition and your rights, you gain the rights from other colleagues and diplomats as well.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think that Israel needs more of that approach in its diplomacy rather than less. Um, you know, I think you're someone who has, a lot of experience in terms of dealing with Americans. You were educated in the United States. You served for a while as a shliach to the United States. I think that's when I first met you during your time there. Um, what do you think about the state of relations between American Jews and Israel? It's sort of a very touchy topic. It's certainly true that younger Jews and younger American Jews seem to feel less of a connection to Israel in spite of the progress that was made with Birthright. There's a lot of growing support, sadly, for sort of anti-Zionist groups and far left groups. What do you think Israel has to do in terms of making that better? Or is there really anything that one can do that Israel can do? Is this largely an American Jewish problem that has to do with sort of education and assimilation rather than Israel changing its policies or its politicians to suit American tastes?
So first, I don't think everything is so bad. We always tend to speak about the disagreements, but I think in general we have so much in common. We care about the same issues, and I felt it when I lived with my family in New York City for 5 years. My kids went to Jewish day school. That they went to summer camps in the summer. They have friends from all over the U.S., and I think we have so much in common. But sometimes in the media we tend to put the lights on the disagreements. But we have to do more, mainly with the younger generation, the high school kids, to get them more engaged about Jewish life. And it works both ways. I want Israelis to know more about Jews in the diaspora, and I want the Jews abroad to be more connected to Judaism, to Zionism, to Israel. I think that's where we should put the energy and the funds, and it's the role of the Israeli government to be involved with that. It's strategically we want to make sure we have Jewish continuity in different communities, and that's why I think we have to invest more and to bring younger kids to Israel. Not only birthright is great, I support it for many years, but we have to start to invest in younger kids being involved and connected to Israel.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Should Israel be doing something specifically to counter the sort of support for BDS in the United States, which has a certain resonance with a certain percentage of American Jews and young American Jews who are susceptible to sort of the rhetoric of the left? I mentioned intersectionality and critical race theory, which has a real foothold in American education and certainly in the mindset of liberal Jews in this country who make up the majority. Is there something Israel can do specifically to counter that, or is this just a matter of just standing up for itself on the world stage as it has to do in other venues?
No, we are together. We have to be involved in everything that concerns Jewish life worldwide. And when you speak about BDS, we have to empower the students, give them the tools, the knowledge, the spirit to engage, not to sit idly by. I recall that I had an event in the General Assembly of the UN to educate students about fighting BDS. And we brought more than 3,000 students to the General Assembly. And the fact that in this place, where usually people are actually attacking Israel, we empowered those students. It was an amazing event where Ambassador Haley and Nathan Sharansky and many other leaders spoke to the students. And when they left the UN after a very long day, they went back to campus ready and more knowledgeable to fight back. So I think, yes, Israel can do more and should invest more on that.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, one of the issues, and sort of this is another one of those disconnect issues. Obviously, people involved in the reform and conservative movements in the United States, take it very hard, the lack of recognition for their streams in Israel and the situation at the Kotel. Obviously, Israelis are more concerned with other issues because Reform and Conservative Judaism, makes up a very, very tiny percentage of the Jewish population in Israel. I think at various times, various prime ministers have all tried to sort of, as it would say in American politics, to jawbone this, to try to talk past it, try to calm things down, but it doesn't seem to go away. It is a point that irritates the relationship. Is there anything, beyond real compromise that can be done to improve that situation?
Well, I learned that the UN, that our adversaries do not make the distinction between left or right, or whether you're Reform, Orthodox, or conservative, and we have to realize that. We have to appreciate what we have, and Israel is open. Most Israelis will welcome any Jew coming to Israel. But unfortunately, you have a lot of politics involved on both sides. Both here in Israel, also in the diaspora, and they try to make it a big issue. But in general, most Israelis are happy to have anyone coming to Israel, praying in Israel, celebrating in Israel. And I can tell you, frankly, we missed it, because of COVID. We haven't seen so many of our family members and friends spending time in Israel. And I want to take this opportunity and tell everybody the airport is open. There is no COVID. Plan your next trip to Israel.
Yeah, well, I second that. I got back as soon as I could, and I think more people should do the same. Before we turn to sort of politics in Israel, which I know is something that you're very concerned with and knowledgeable about, what is it, do you think, about Israel that and most American Jews are most ignorant? I mean, obviously, you're somebody who knows American Jewry from your experiences here. What is the one thing you would want American Jews to understand about Israel that you think most of them don't know?
I think they should realize that the Israelis are very happy. Because when you speak about Israel, usually you speak about problems, about terror attacks, God forbid, about conflicts. But when you come to Israel, you see normal people living very happy life. When you look at when the people compare the level of happiness of Israelis, I think we're in the top 10 every year.
Hmm.
In a much better place than the US and Canada and many other Western democracies. And it's true. Israelis are happy, they live a good life, and I think they should know that despite everything they hear or they read, it's a great place to live and to bring up your family.
Yeah, well, I think that's an excellent point to make. Let's turn to Israel right now and what's going on there. How do you rate the chances of the current coalition government's survival? They seem to have weathered the loss of an absolute majority with one defector from Prime Minister Bennett's Yamina party. They're still there, and it's not clear what can or will topple them. Do you think it can continue at least until Bennett is supposed to give way to Foreign Minister Lapid next year, or do you see something happening before then?
I served in the Knesset for many years, and I was very involved in the coalition maintenance process. And I cannot see the coalition continues without a majority. Technically, you can survive, but you cannot govern. You cannot pass legislation, pass the budget. So basically, every week you have to beg, you have to bribe someone in order to survive the day. So I don't think it will last until next summer when the rotation should take place between Prime Minister Bennett and Lapid. But they might be able to stay for a while. But I think that people understand today in the political system that we are heading for another elections. The question is when it will happen. It can happen either in the fall or in the winter, but we are heading there.
So you think this is just they're on borrowed time, and that this situation can't continue, even with the Arab Party, the Joint List, sort of giving them their tacit support so that they don't go to new elections.
Yeah, I think it might not be immediate, but I think you cannot govern and survive for the long term. So now they opened the summer session until the end of July. So I think they can work very hard to try to survive until the end of the summer. But once they come back in the fall and have to pass a budget for 2023, I think that will be impossible.
Yeah, well, it was the last budget was years in the making. Who knows when the next budget will be passed, right? Um, Although you are a Likud official, you're the head of World Likud. You were also at times, a strong critic of former Prime Minister Netanyahu, as well as someone who served with him as a colleague and an ally. Many believe it was his refusal to sort of give way, to name a successor, to even acknowledge that there could be a successor, that put this Bennett Lapid Ra'am party, coalition into power. There's still a majority of the Knesset is still right wing, certainly on foreign policy, security issues. But there wasn't a majority for Netanyahu to stay as prime minister. Um, as long as Netanyahu is the head of the Likud, and he certainly is, it doesn't seem to be in much danger of being challenged in that role right now. How can the current conundrum, in which Likud remains the largest party, but cannot have the support of other right wing parties to help it form a coalition, survive? I mean, what's got to give here? I mean, does Netanyahu somehow persuade parties that seem to exist to oppose him to join him, or does he have to give way?
So I believe in democracy, and like you mentioned, I'm involved in the party for many years. I actually ran against Netanyahu for the chairmanship of the party, and I lost. He won, and I respected the result, and we continue to work together. And we should respect democracy, as long as the majority of the Likud members will support him and elect him as the chairman. He is the chairman, and that's part of the democracy. I think if we want to come back to power, it means that the Likud will have to show an amazing result in the ballots. Basically, we need to receive almost 40 seats in the next Knesset. and then we will have the ability to form a government. It's not going to be easy. We will have to mobilize people to vote. Last time, people were not so much into it. So we will have to think about different ways to convince them to get out and vote. If we do get, to 40 seats, then you can form a coalition with Netanyahu as the prime minister.
That's true, although certainly the odds would be against you. I mean, it's been a long time since any party has come close, really, to getting 40 seats in any Knesset election. It's part of the Israeli system. People can vote from multiplicity of parties representing a very narrow point of view, and people got used to voting for parties that were not Likud, but which would be part of a Likud-led majority. That's no longer true. And yet at the same time, people are, the things that I hear from Israelis is that the idea of, after 4 elections in 2 years, they'd like a bit more of a break from it. But what you're telling us is that they're not going to continue to get that break. They're going to have another election. And, what happens if we just get the same result? I mean, that's part of the conundrum here in terms of Netanyahu. You're right, being the head of the Likud, being the largest party, but still not forming a majority.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think people when they go to vote, they will have to take it into consideration and thinking about which party they are voting, whether they are voting the small. I always try to advocate to vote for the large parties. Even if from left to right. I think the system is problematic when you have too many parties in Israel. The stability is an issue, and after you get elected as prime minister, Jonathan, you have to deal with maintenance, and I think it's a problem with our system that you have to make sure every week you have the support in the parliament, and you cannot really focus on governing and doing the right thing for the country.
Yeah, in terms of this current government, right now, I mean, there's some of its supporters or members are spinning to the Israeli press that they feel their attitude towards the Biden administration succeeded. For the moment, the negotiations between between Iran and the United States seem to be stalemated. The Biden administration wants desperately to revive the Iran nuclear deal. The Iranians just keep asking for more and more, and for the moment, that's a stalemate. That Bennett and Lapid say, well, that shows we were right not to confront the United States, to sort of downplay our differences over the existential threat from Iran. What do you see Israel's future in dealing with this issue? Because that's one of, the top issues that any Israeli government, no matter who is leading it, has to face. And so long as the Biden administration is in power, they're going to be working towards more appeasement, more of a rapprochement with Iran. How does Israel deal with its greatest ally undermining it in this way?
I'm very worried about that because I agree with you that the administration in Washington is very much in a rush to sign the JCPOA all over again. It was a bad deal in 2015. It's even worse today. I don't understand why they are doing it. I hope it will not happen. But if it will happen, it means that we will have to deal with the Iranian threat by ourselves. It's challenging, it's problematic, but we are capable of doing it. I hope that the US will not do it because, when I speak with my colleagues in Washington, they know that the Iranians are lying. They know that, it's not going to support any stability in the region, but I get the feeling there is a tendency to just move on. Let's sign something and move on. In our region, when you make such a mistake, you pay a heavy price for that.
Yeah, well, you of course have so much experience in dealing with them. Both a Democratic administration and a Republican administration, being there during both the Obama years and the Trump years. The question is, how did these changes of power? Obviously, the approach of the Republican administration was very different towards Israel than that of the Democrats. Where do you see with the Democrats still in power and with them committed to a very different attitude towards Israel, do you worry about the alliance between the two countries, or do you think it's so strong that these sort of change switches in policies, even over an existential issue like Iran, is not as important as the ties between the two nations?
No, the bond is strong, and it will continue to be strong. But at the same time, we have to be honest about our concerns, and we should speak up about them. I can give you one example. When Secretary Blinken came to Israel before the month of Ramadan, and he actually said that he called the Israelis to show restraint about settler violence. I was shocked, because we know that the issue of the month of Ramadan is not the settlers; it's the incitement by radical
Mhm.
Muslims that take advantage of the month of Ramadan to incite on the issue of the Temple Mount. So if I was there instead of Prime Minister Bennett, I would on the spot would tell the secretary that is wrong, and he should not blame the Israelis. He should actually speak about the radical Muslims who are inciting and planning. And unfortunately, they were successful because we had a horrible month, Jonathan. The number of casualties and terror attacks, it was horrible. I think the same with the Iran deal. If we see that it's going to a bad place, we should speak up against it. Even if we will not be able to change the result, at least for the record, we will have the legitimacy to take action in the future when everybody will know that we were against this agreement.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. How would you? It leads into my next question, which is about the events of the last several weeks, which is seemingly a new wave of terror affecting Israel with more deaths, more attacks, seemingly every week. How do you rate the Israeli government's approach to the security issue? Is this something that is beyond its capacity to stamp out entirely, or do you think there's more that they could be doing? And do you think sort of their handling of the Temple Mount issue, which is sort of as it has in the past, was sort of used as the excuse for more violence, especially during Ramadan? Do you think there's some fault there?
So, we have to be honest that, terrorism was there and will be there also in the future. It's part of our life.
Hmm.
When we were in power and now when we're in the opposition. But I think when you have a government that has to count on the support of radical Muslim parties, it's problematic. And for me, I was very disappointed. In Passover, I was with my family in Jerusalem, and when Jews wanted to approach the Western Wall, they were attacked. Buses
Right.
were attacked, and I didn't see a proper response by our government and by our security forces. And my position is that we do believe in freedom of religion, but for everybody. Not only for Muslims on the Temple Mount, also for Christians and for Jews who want to practice their religion. And what we saw in the last few weeks, that the reaction of the government was weak. They tried to appease the radical Muslim parties in their coalition, and they were afraid. And once you are afraid, our enemies sense it, and they become bolder and they attack more. So I think the approach should have been different from the beginning.
Yeah. How much of a role does the very dicey situation in Jordan play in this? Obviously, Jordan's king has to posture about the Temple Mount. Jordanians have certain rights that they've been granted, and Israel is at the same time, very concerned not to do anything that would undermine the position of the current, of the regime in Jordan, because it's basically friendly to Israel, even though it seems as if the Jordanian people as a whole, which are mostly Palestinian, are extremely hostile to Israel. How does Israel sort of square that circle with, with this very delicate relationship with its neighbor?
So we have an open dialogue with the Jordanians. Unfortunately, we saw very disturbing remarks coming from the Prime Minister of Jordan and other member of parliament. But we know that it's their interest that there will be stability in the region, and we will continue to cooperate with them. But sometimes, I would expect from the leadership to be strong, and even if it means that they should not support the riots on Temple Mount, but unfortunately, they tend to ignore the reality and to join the choir by condemning Israel when they know very well they have the representatives on Temple Mount, the Waqf, that can actually tell them exactly what's happening there, what's happening in the mosques. If you are a Muslim and you see the horrible things that they are doing inside the mosques, that's something that I think they should not tolerate.
Yeah, and it's sort of in its own way, it's also there's an anomalous situation with the Palestinian Authority, which continues to incite terrorism, continues to subsidize it, and yet Israel needs the Palestinian Authority, or seemingly needs it to not collapse. Um, how does And you served in a government that had to deal with Abbas. Is there any way other than just sort of this ongoing unsatisfactory compromise with Abbas? Because as long as he's there, he doesn't want to compromise. He doesn't want to make peace. He doesn't really want to make war, but he wants to make the situation continue to be uncomfortable and to posture for his people and to let them, sometimes incite violence. Is there anything Israel can do to improve that situation, which really isn't within their control in terms of who's leading the Palestinians?
I feel bad for the Palestinians because the leadership they have, both in Gaza and in Ramallah. And I think we will have to be patient and wait until a new Palestinian leader will emerge after Abbas. And then hopefully, we can speak about how to support the lives of the Palestinians, promote the dialogue, the cooperation. But as of now, like you said, Jonathan, you were absolutely to the point. He wants to stay in power, period. He doesn't care about the well being of the Palestinians. He doesn't care about the incitement. And for him, every day that he's in power, it's a win. So for us, it's bad news. And for the Palestinians, it's bad news.
Is the two-state solution, which is sort of as far as the diplomatic world is considered, still the magic word in terms of what the solution to the conflict should be? Is it dead? Um, Certainly, the Palestinians have no interest in it. The majority of Israelis have been completely disillusioned by the collapse of Oslo, by the conduct of the Palestinians and ongoing terrorism. And yet, the Americans and the international community still talk about it. Is it worth talking about? What will, assuming that after Abbas, who won't live forever, at least I don't think so, um, is it even a theoretical possibility with a new Palestinian leadership? Because after all, the next Palestinian leader might actually be worse than Abbas, not better.
So I think, it's today is the time to speak about what can happen, not about what cannot happen. And when we see that there is no partner, and we see that the Palestinians are paying salaries for convicted terrorists, continue with the incitement. So no one in Israel is even arguing about the issue of Palestinian state. I remember as a child, every election that was the main issue. Whether we should give up land for peace or we should build a Palestinian state or not. It's not an issue anymore because today realize that it's not about recognizing any Palestinian state. It's about recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. We look at what's happening in Gaza today. We pulled out 17 years ago. We pulled out of Gaza, and Hamas took over. And instead of building their own institutions and independence, look what they did. They used the funds to build rockets and tunnels against us. So that's the main issue. You need somebody to discuss it, and today there is no one to discuss it with.
Right, right. Let me ask you just before we conclude. You've served in the Knesset, you've served as a diplomat. Now you're the author of a new book, and you're still involved with Likud. What's your next step? Are you looking to rejoin the Knesset if there are new elections sometime in the next year or two? What's your future?
Well, first I can tell you that next week I'm coming to the US to promote the book. So, I just
Okay.
got the first copy and I'm excited about it. so it will take a lot of energy for me. But definitely, I intend to go back to public life, Jonathan. I intend to use the skills, the connection, the knowledge I acquired in the UN to become a stronger and better public servant. And I don't know to tell you exactly when it will happen, but I can tell you that I'm excited to go back to public life and to continue to serve the people and the country I love so much.
Well, Danny, we want to thank you so much for coming on today. I want to wish you good luck with your book as well as with all your future activities on behalf of Israel. We also want to thank our audience, whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us on Facebook, the JNS YouTube channel, or on JBS TV. Please like and or subscribe to Top Story and give us good reviews. Please let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself. And we'll see you again next week.